Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed today, and thank you very much for contributing to the panel during the workshop on co-creative arts and relational care that we had on the 11th of July at the Catalyst here in Newcastle. Could you say a little bit about yourself and your background at the Arts Council England, and maybe what your career was? How did you get to where you are at the moment?
Sure. So I'm Sarah Harrison. I'm Senior Manager for Engagement and Communities at Arts Council England. I've done that role now for about 6 years, and prior to that I was a relationship manager in the North East for Arts Council Engagement and Communities Relationship Manager. So I looked after a portfolio of organisations that kind of, including creative people and places organisations, that their focus was on how to engage more communities, more people in arts and cultural activities. Prior to that, I worked in the sector, and I worked in marketing and audience development for a variety of different arts organisations in England, in the North East, and also up in Scotland, in Glasgow. I think my career, in terms of my career, the reason why I kind of went down this path was actually frustrations working in a marketing department for an arts organization around product first, so selling arts and cultural experiences to people without really considering what arts and cultural experiences they might want. So I think that's the trajectory of my career has taken me into Arts Council England, and now the focus of my work is really on demand-led arts and culture experiences. So thinking about how arts and culture organisations can take into account the needs of their local communities, the needs of targeted communities of people, for example, older people, and work with them rather than delivering events for them, work with them to decide what kind of arts and culture opportunities they want to experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense, doesn't it, really, to try and sort of work out what people actually need. And it's something that you would think would be fairly obvious, but in reality, I suspect you're probably one of the first groups of people who are actually doing that. It's sort of, because somebody's a little bit elderly, right, okay, we know what you need, you will enjoy this, instead of actually asking them what they will actually enjoy. That clearly makes
sense. Certainly. I mean, I think it's been sort of, it's been happening for a number of years. That we always say we're standing on the shoulder of giants. There's been a lot of activity around including communities in decision making in arts and culture, but it's always been hidden, sort of happening on the back burner sort of thing, and we want to forefront it a little bit more, and that's what Arts Council England's 10-year strategy Let's Create really brought out from Arts Council. So this idea that it's just as important to kind of work with communities and understand what they need, and also work in partnership with other non-arts and culture organisations to kind of make sure that the reach for arts and culture is as wide as it can possibly be.
Thank you very much. I think that's really impressive, and it's really good to see. I mean, one of the things you were talking about was the sort of the level of research that's gone into demonstrating the success of this sort of work more broadly. And I myself have been involved in a number of projects over the last 5 to 10 years. One of the things that's always a challenge, I think, with this sort of work is to be able to demonstrate effectively the value of what we are actually doing. And I think that is immensely difficult. I think we've made the case, but it's still sometimes quite hard for funders and policymakers to actually accept it. So did you have a particular view on those sort of challenges?
Yeah, I agree. I think we are continuously, as a funder and development agency, Arts Council is constantly asking people who they give grants to kind of make the case, and also to demonstrate impact and evidence the impact of their work. I think where we've had struggled in the past has been around, organizations or individuals and artists being able to have the skills and the knowledge and resources and toolkits to be able to evidence the data, the hard data. And quite often, we're arts and culture, we're really used to telling great stories and giving great case studies and, showing the impact in a kind of softer way on people. But, when we talk to central government, quite often it's data driven, and you really need to show the hard facts. You know, this is the impact it's had on somebody's well-being. This is the impact it's had on, you know, return on investment. Sort of, you know, how is investing in arts and culture better than investing in the NHS, for example, and using that data approach has been quite challenging for a lot of people. It's not their bread and butter work. However, we are making, I think, strides in that direction, and we do now encourage organisations and individuals to use a sort of similar set of evaluation methodologies, so that we can have as a kind of country a broader evidence base, particularly when we're thinking about working with older people, for example, when we've had programs in the past like Celebrating Age, which was a targeted program for arts and culture people, arts and cultural organisations working with older people. We asked them to all use a similar set of metrics to measure impact on the older people. And we used a methodology called Most Significant Change for that as well. So I think the evidence is there, and you know, we have countless case studies and countless evaluation reports around that. And I think we have made the case, as you say, Andrew, but I think yeah, what's difficult is getting people to listen now and act on that. And I think, you know, that's been challenging for multiple numbers of reasons. Recent events, you know, COVID, the cost of living crisis, everything. There's always something more important and something more immediate that people have to deal with. And I think it's difficult to make systematic change for the long term when you've got short-term crisis after crisis after crisis. So I think that's probably.
I think it's sort of trying to engage people in the longer term is enormously difficult, because you know, politicians, funders have to see what's immediately in front of them, don't they, and respond to that. But it's a dreadful shame that they can't see a longer perspective as well. So have artists actually taken up these new models that you've introduced very well, or is that in itself quite a challenge to try to get artists to think in those? Because it's going to be alien, isn't it? It's not surprising that it's going to be alien to them.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some differentiating success, I think. Some, obviously, for organisations that are bigger and have dedicated people working in those areas where they can kind of have, or they have like the infrastructure to have volunteers to do surveys with people, or they have the toolkit to work with, it's a lot easier. Where it's more difficult is like an individual artist or a facilitator sort of working in a care home, for example, delivering a workshop and them having the knowledge and expertise, because as I said earlier, you know, it's not necessarily their area of expertise isn't, you know, doing a survey with people. It's they're there as an artist, and that's for, you know, foremost what they should be there to do. So that is a challenge. And I think one of the other difficulties is when you are trying to apply a kind of standard methodology for impact measurement, that methodology doesn't necessarily work for people with vulnerabilities, or, you know, people who access information in different ways. For example, you know, surveying somebody at the start of a session who has dementia and then surveying them at the end to see what impact that workshop or activities had on them is really difficult, and actually can create quite a barrier for people. So that's where we're kind of thinking more about like the storytelling side of things and the most significant change model, where you can demonstrate a kind of impact on someone from just it's kind of person-centered, and they can tell the story rather than it be they said that yes to this, and then at the end they said, you know, yes to this question, which means they've had an impact. It's rather the story of that person's impact.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
That can be really engaging as an evaluation model, but it's also very time consuming to get to grips with if you're a funder, for example. You have to read a story rather than just look at some data.
Yeah. No, we tried this sort of before and after model for dementia imagination. We were required to do it by the funder. And clearly, when you're talking to people with fairly advanced dementia, they're going to be deteriorating over a period of time anyway. So you maybe work with them over 3 months. It may be getting worse over that period. Also, we tried to work with people with more advanced dementia rather than early stages, because on the whole, people with more advanced dementia get left out of these sort of studies because it's difficult, because they're not easy to work with.
Yeah.
So they tend to get ignored. But we made a point of trying to work with them, and somebody may have lost language over a period of 3 months, so that you can't necessarily interview somebody. And the fact that they can't remember something because they've got memory problems doesn't mean it doesn't have any value. I think that is something that we've come out of that situation very, very convinced by. So there's all these sort of challenges to that sort of traditional before and after model. And while we tried it, we weren't actually able to identify very much. But that didn't actually mean it wasn't a great experience for them. And you might get sort of the fact that their carers might see a change, so you may be able to do that.
Yeah.
And I think what was very evident when we were sort of working with this group is that, as a researcher, we had to step into their world.
Yeah.
And in a way, by trying to adhere to that sort of a model, we were expecting them to step into ours, and that was never going to work. So, I walked in there to do the interviews and say, well, why did I try to do that? That made absolutely no sense. I should have known it from the start, but we didn't. We were quite naive, and even though we had this money to do this project, we were quite naive in the ways that on the models one actually had to adopt when working with this group. Great
Definitely.
people, the artists were fantastic, but extremely hard to do the research.
I think the point you made there about carers is an interesting one, and something that probably we need to explore a little bit more about, especially if people are working with people with dementia or other vulnerabilities, that they prohibit them from engaging in a survey or that blunt instrument of just asking somebody some questions. Maybe, and also just thinking about care home staff as well, about like how we can demonstrate impact on them rather than on the individual. So we don't want to negate the individual's experience, of course, and we would still capture that through various methods like storytelling or capturing video or photographs of the person enjoying the activity. But it's more about the change that the people who care for them see in them, rather than measuring it in a kind of data way. Maybe there's something else we can be looking at around the care home staff, and actually thinking about how we convince people to use arts and culture in care homes. Maybe that's going to have more of an impact if we know there's a set of data and evidence from care home staff and the management of care homes going, actually, over this 5-year project, when we were working with X museum, we saw that our staff, had positive experiences. They found that the people they were working with required less support. Various ways of doing that rather than looking at participant. That might be more persuasive.
I think you're right. It's a better way of doing it. We also got the artists involved to create a diary.
Yeah.
We found that really useful.
Yeah.
Really helpful to try and get the perspectives of the artists on it, and what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and the impact of what they were doing actually on their residents, and how the various strategies they adopted panned out. Because after each session, we would sit down with the artists and actually go through it and say, well, what did you think? Did this work? Did that work? They were immensely skilled, the artists involved that we had, immensely skilled, and they would almost intuitively read a room.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of experience with people living with dementia, and they would decide what their strategy and what they were actually going to do. I think they came with a range of different possibilities, and depending on what they felt, reading the room properly, they went down a particular route at a particular pace. Sometimes would split people up into those who had less dementia and those perhaps who had more. But it was really very successful. But there's no way that I could have done that. It needed an experienced artist to be able to make those sort of judgments. But it was remarkable to see. And through that, we did get an idea really about how the work was being accepted, or not accepted in some instances, but mostly accepted by the residents.
Yeah.
And I know the artists sometimes were worried about the presence of carers and family members, and that they tried again, very understandably, almost to sort of take over a little bit. So if they had a relative who had become quite disabled by dementia, the family member or the carer would try to do the activity for them. And of course, that's exactly what we didn't really want.
Yeah.
But it's a very difficult thing to stop happening, to be quite honest.
Yeah, of
Very
course it
difficult
is.
thing to stop happening. But
Yeah.
that's an enormous challenge, this sort of measurement and how we provide evidence for funders. I think that's quite a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think some of the things which you've mentioned would help to resolve that, I think. But just trying the before and after model, particularly with the sort of somebody with memory problems, is always going to be a bit of a challenge, unfortunately. It's probably not really going to work.
And just, I think, the nature of the way projects are funded, and this, you know, I suppose we recognize, I think so we've got an open access fund called Project National Lottery Project Grants, and anyone can access it, anyone can apply. And sort of we fund that through area budgets rather than on a national basis. Gives the areas more control and, you know, and power over who gets funded in their area, as it should be. But what makes that difficult is there's like an ad hoc approach across the country. So, you know, we're not really able to track, you know, the impact on all of the programs that are working with older people, or all of the programs that are working in care homes, unless we do a national, like Celebrating Age, for example, a national program where we applied one form of kind of methodology to it. So we then could come out of it with a very convincing evaluation report at the end of it. And obviously we're not the only funder in this field either. So you've got lots of different funders, you know, even, you know, healthcare providers doing work in this area. But there's no one sort of central point where all of this information is going. Undoubtedly, there's so much rich information coming out of these ad hoc, small scale, £15,000 projects across the country. But it's just kind of going into the ether, and there's no way of kind of collecting it all together in one thing.
No, I know, absolutely. It's an enormous challenge. It's been a challenge within the arts sector. I mean, broadly, when I grew up in the sort of museum and gallery sector, and I'm still partially there. And these sort of challenges of being able to demonstrate value have been there really since probably probably the early 1990s, to be quite honest. They go back a long way. And despite all the investment over this very, very long period of time, in some ways, I don't feel we're any closer to getting a satisfactory answer out of it. But I think you're right in that you need some sort of qualitative approach, I think, for funders, and they're always going to want that. It's going to be quite hard, certainly in our position, to actually change that. But also having good stories about people, I think that again can be immensely powerful. And probably we need a sort of perhaps a two-tier approach to it. So you've got those fantastic stories, and there's nothing like standing in front of a group of people and giving them an example of somebody who's really benefited from engaging with an arts activity, somebody who's had dementia, to really, really inspire people. So those stories are immensely powerful, and I think you're right to keep going with those. We probably need something else as well, doing the best we can with it, in order to give funders what they actually want, because I don't think we're really going to change what the Treasury wants when it sort of requires a certain pieces of evidence in order to support funding in a particular way. As you might see in the Green Book or the Magenta Book, these sort of models for public investment, it's going to be very, very hard for us to actively change those. But we have got fantastic stories, I think, and I think they're really powerful too.
Yeah, and it's also knowing who we need to influence as well, sort of who the audience is. I mean, because there's sort of an argument as well around how we persuade care homes to put more effort or time into this sort of work. And just thinking about earlier when we were talking about the impact on care home staff, and you know, their return on investment in engaging in this kind of work, that is such a vital part of the puzzle, isn't it? To be able to say to care homes, oh, well, actually, you know, it seems like you don't have the time to, you know, engage this artist and support the work of this artist in your care home 1 day a week. But the impact of them doing that will help you in these ways that, you know, in the future you'll feel it's beneficial, because the participants who've engaged in it won't require quite so much support in the future from your staff. But again, it's it's that sort of everyone's experiencing, local authorities, cultural organisations, care homes, you know, housing associations, the NHS, we're all feeling like firefight, deal with today's problem, but unable to kind of get past next week. Never mind, you know, 5 years' time when we're going to feel the benefits of some of these interventions.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, one of the things I did notice on one of the care homes we worked in is that the work that the residents were doing was actually put on the walls of the care home, and people were being shown around, families being shown around, and presumably they had a relative who would either move in there or to another care home, and they were being shown this work as the stuff that the residents did.
Mm.
So what they were doing is selling the care home on the back of the activities that we were doing with them. And that I thought was absolutely fantastic, because if you get it into the business plan that it becomes a selling point, then you can't argue with it. It's got this momentum once it's there, once it's seen by management as a way of continuing with the funding and business and income generation. That then it can only be good, and I've only ever seen that once, but I thought, you know, the light bulb went off over my head, like, bing, you know, this is really what we want to encourage.
It seems like such an obvious thing, that as well, doesn't it? And I think, I mean, it's certainly from the perspective of where we're coming from. So I think a lot of this work falls in the gap between creative health and well-being and arts and culture. So it doesn't fit easily with either of those two things, really. For me, this is about, you know, creating opportunities for people to engage. Doesn't matter who they are. So that's what the outcome in Let's Create is. You know, people are able to explore their creativity at any part of their life, and that includes when they're, you know, in a care home and they're over 80 and they have difficulty for various reasons in doing that. We still want to allow them to access those opportunities and just engage in something for the sheer joy of doing that, not because it's going to have X impact on their health and well-being. You know, that kind of comes as a secondary benefit to, from my perspective. I know that's not the focus of other, you know, funders, but certainly from my perspective, that's what's important, you know, ensuring people have like a high quality life right until the end. And it's coming to us all, you know, and that's what I think is frustrating sometimes, because I think actually the example you've just given of that care home, advertising it as being something that is a reason for that person to go and live there, is that they've got joyful experiences that they can engage in right up until the end. And that's what I want out of my later life. So it's, you know, why doesn't everyone understand that? You know, I kind of think, again, we as people are unable to kind of see the future and go, oh, that's future me. Like,
absolutely,
don't need to deal with that. I'm like, well, I'm going to be in a care home one day. Yeah, and I want to be doing great arts and culture while I'm there. Thanks.
Totally. I mean, don't we all? I mean, who on earth would argue with that? That's
exactly.
That's a fantastic objective, isn't it, to be able to do stuff all the way through. And that's what we need in terms of quality of life. And I'm really supportive of your view that it's about quality of life and not health outcomes. And they're not dissimilar. They do overlap. But trying to, you know, if you think about going back to the policy argument, if you go down the health outcomes route, then you've got all sorts of problems of trying to identify what that actually is. And I think it becomes a bit of a rabbit hole that becomes almost impossible to extract yourself from. And the demands made of arts and culture, you're almost seeing it in the way that you would a medical intervention. So it's a problem I have with the term interventions, really, that it sort of, it implies it's like a one-off or a course of this. And it really isn't that. It's a way of life. It's a way you think. It's a way you behave. It's not just something you do on a Wednesday afternoon between 2 and 3. It's part of who you are completely.
Yeah, but I think it's because people are so used to now having to make that case, because funding isn't as, you know, as available as it maybe once was. So people are trying to get funding from various different sources, and for that reason they are beholden to that funder's objectives. So if that's a health and health and well-being funder, then they have to make the case that it's going to have the impacts that funder needs to show.
I agree completely. If whatever funding you have from a funder, you're going to be evaluating in terms of the priorities that the funder has given you.
Yeah.
there may be a whole raft of other things too. And I've often felt that you need to make a distinction between, if you like, providing evidence for a funder. And if you're going to do research, that's fine, but that's something separate.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the same as being given a series of priority or headings that you map yourself against, which often happens. So that's not research. That's something else. That's evaluation, if you like, and research. If you have the capacity and the time and the money and everything else, which mostly you don't, to be honest, that is something separate to it. It's no less valuable, but it needs to be thought of in a different way. And muddling the two causes us all sorts of problems, I think, to try and sort of pull them both together.
Yeah, and I think we've got the issue of people think making people's quality of life better by giving them creative opportunities, as they see that as a luxury. They don't see that as something that's absolutely essential to the way society should work.
I agree.
And that's like a philosophical, fundamental challenge that we've all got to overcome, and we haven't yet. So, it's seen as secondary and not as important as, keeping somebody from having a heart attack. So yeah, it's, I think it's more important, actually. I think your quality of life and the way you live your life is probably more important than how you are prevented from dying. In lots of
I agree, particularly with older people. There's,
Yeah.
I mean, the Care Quality Commission sort of prioritizes, as somebody in the workshop, I forget who described the hamster wheel of care. Well, that's really all you're doing. It's the practical things, which of course you need. You need the practice. You need to make sure that people have the right medication at the right time, and they're clean and they're looked after. But that's only a very, very basic starting point.
Yeah.
If you don't have quality of life as well, then you question everything. And I think that's what happened during COVID quite a lot, that particularly older people may have been locked in their rooms in care homes. They would have been fed and looked after in a practical sense, but it would have been like being in a prison.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't, there's no point existing if it's just that, I don't think, for anyone.
No, and I mean, I couldn't put words in anyone's mouth. It's certainly not the way I would want to live. Like when I'm, older, I'd rather kind of
take a few risks
than be
and have a better
stuck
quality
in a
of
room
life
with no joy.
No, and I think that, again, one of the carers of the care home I was thinking of that we've been working with a little bit more subsequently said exactly that there was no joy in the care home during COVID at all. It had all just gone completely. And it was better once, care home had finished. Sorry, the COVID had finished and things were getting more back to normal. But during the COVID period itself, it was very hard, I think, for people in that sort of context.
Yeah.
Could I ask you a little bit about funding? Obviously, one of the issues with care homes at the moment is that quite a lot of the external relationships have been lost. And even though COVID has been really as a consequence of COVID, and even though it's a year or two back now, those relationships are still quite fragile, if they're there at all. A number of places I've been to recently where they've all completely evaporated and they haven't been reinstigated presumably because of workload pressures and all sorts of other problems. So it's not a criticism of them. So, from my point of view, what I would like to do is to help them reestablish those links.
Yeah.
So how do we do that, you think? Because there is funding potentially available from Arts Council England for this sort of work. How do we get them involved?
It's
very difficult.
So whilst we aren't currently, I've mentioned Celebrating Age a couple of times in this conversation. So that was like a specialist targeted program. We aren't running anything like that at the moment. No specialisms for older people, but it is a strand that is through Let's Create. So the outcome I mentioned earlier about people accessing creativity throughout their life. So at the moment, we fund this sort of work through a variety of models. So we've got our national portfolio organisations that deliver work, and they're kind of the arts and museums and theatres and that sort of thing. So they're what we call arts and cultural organisations, if you like, the established ones. And then we've got project grants, which is open to all different types of organisation and or artists and individuals as well. And we also run Creative People and Places, which is it's a program that's designed for communities in the least engaged places. So that you have to be part of you have to be delivering work in an eligible local authority to access the funding. And it's also a really interesting one because it's part of a consortium approach, and by consortium we mean multiple partners. And as part of the partnerships, we ask that we have a community partner on the consortium. So potentially there is space there for care homes to become partners in like a Creative People and Places program bid, or just in a wider place partnership bid. So I think care homes are, critical community partners. Obviously, they're residential places where lots of people gather. They could be really valuable partners, and they should be seen to be really valuable community partners. We do a lot of our Creative People and Places programs work with wider housing associations, but I can't think of one that has a care home on their consortium. I imagine they work with care homes on an ad hoc basis. I couldn't tell you actually one off the top of my head that does do that. But what I would say is the impetus for that needs to come from both directions. So, I understand that care homes and their management do not have the time to come out of the care home and look for partnerships and build partnerships and relationships with their local kind of communities. But I would also put to cultural organisations that they need to start connecting with care homes, but also care homes need to recognise the value of those opportunities when they come along. Because what's difficult, I suppose, is a cultural organisation to approach a care home and sell the idea of being on this partnership to that care home. The care homes also need to understand that the value of being on the partnership and committing some time to that. So yeah, it's a two-way street, I think. And I don't have the answer. A lot of the time with place partnerships, it comes from maybe an individual in an organization who sees the value in it and will go out and make those connections. And quite often we're frustrated when there's lack of infrastructure in places, and that individual then moves on, and then those relationships just seem to crumble. There isn't like anything to kind of hold that. And Arts Council was certainly really open to having conversations in area about place work. It's part of our priority, and we have priority places now at Arts Council. So do look on the website, I would say, if anyone is interested in engaging in place work, or there's a care home out there listening to this who wants to get engaged, look on the Arts Council's website. You'll see a list of priority places, and if you have care homes in that place, you could connect to the arts and culture organisations in that place. You could speak to an area office and try and kind of become part of a partnership.
I think that'll happen more. I think it happened quite a lot, say, before COVID, and there's been a dislocation during COVID and immediately afterwards. But I suspect the care homes themselves will start reaching out more fairly soon, and the thing will probably go back to a position more like what it was. But I suppose they're also dependent, as you said, on organisations, say, like Equal Arts in the Northeast, to actually negotiate and bring together people in groups. And I know they are doing a lot of that sort of work, but I think there's always more that can be done. Because I think, again, as you said, it's sort of sometimes the whole idea of these relationships are based on one or two people, and sometimes they go, and one of the care homes we worked in, there was one woman who was really good, and she was responsible for all these sort of activities, and she would coordinate with us and coordinate with artists, do all sorts of really good work. But for example, say somebody missed a shift, then she would then be slotted into that role, so she would then have to help feeding or looking after people. It's understandable, but it does mean that role was seen as somewhat separate in a way, and I guess that's the reality of working within these places. But it is a challenge.
Yeah,
it's one that I think we can all rise to over a period of time. I'm sure we can do that.
Yeah, I think it ties in. It's, again, I hate to boil down a lot of this to like the kind of fundamental philosophical like ideas of what society is and what a community is, and it's my passion. Communities are like something that I find interesting but also vital, and I think I feel like over the last 20 so years, probably longer, community seems to have like kind of drifted apart, and it may be the digital age, and it may be not having faith organizations be part of the central life of people's life anymore. So like it feels like there's something missing, and I don't quite know what it is, but it's that how to kind of engage a community as one community together and have all of the separate parts come together, and like the separate partners, so like the local authority, but also working with the care homes and the schools and the, you know, and it's seen as part of one holistic thing with the residents as well.
I
I
think
don't
one
have
has
the
to,
answer.
no, neither do I. But I
Wish
was
I did.
heartened by the response in many sisters to the writing. Quite
Yeah,
recently that the community did come out,
yeah,
and it did come out and it did say, no, we're not having this. This isn't
yeah,
what our society is actually like. So something like that did galvanize whole sections of society, which was, I
yeah,
thought, really encouraging. So I think that is still there, but the need to bring the various partners together will always be there, I think, and it's always going to require hard work to actually make that happen. And as you say, there are some examples of it being quite successful, and other times when perhaps it needs a bit more work. But I guess that is the role of organisations, to try and pull them together. And it was one of the things we were trying to do to an extent with the workshops, was trying to get a whole range of people together so they could actually talk to each other. So it wasn't necessarily just us talking to the people who came along, but also over lunch and over the coffee times, people could talk to each other. And you
yeah,
could see a lot of connections actually happening over that, over
yeah.
those periods.
That brings me on to the peer learning program that we're running as well. We're going to start running soon.
Fantastic.
So the creative aging peer learning program, we do already run a place-based peer learning program. And if you were interested, place-based peerlearning.org.uk is the website, and people can go on there, and there's a digital network, like a Facebook kind of page, but for people working in a place-based way. And we're going to launch soon a creative aging version of that. And what we want to do is make sure it's cross-sector. So we want the people to learn from each other, artists and arts organisations to learn from each other, but also bring other sectors onto there. And care homes would, of course, be like one of the key partners that we would want to talk to. And it will be operated via a steering group, and we'll try and kind of create a larger kind of nationwide peer learning program out of that. So there'll be like organized events and stuff, but just the opportunity for people to connect with each other.
Sounds really good.
I think that kind of it could be something that we could also break off into regions to sort of have the practical kind of meetups in the Northeast, for example, so people could then people working in the Northeast can all meet with each other. There are, as you've mentioned, Equal Arts, the brilliant organisation Equal Arts, already do a lot of that kind of convening work, but it's just to offer support to that as well, and make it more equitable across the country.
I think it provides a broader structure, and in a way a more sustainable structure, perhaps.
Yeah.
And Equal Arts do a brilliant job. They do it really well. But to add to what they're doing,
yeah,
I think will be really good. And there's a whole range of academics working in this broad area as well. And at the moment, they coalesce around the Creative Aging Group for the British Society of Gerontology, and I'm sure they'd be very interested in any of that sort of work. They'd want to get involved and sort of help as far as they could. I'm sure they would.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely be in touch about it.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you think we should, or anything you'd like to say?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we've talked about, the value of care homes and becoming part of the community partners. One of the things, I mean, that I noticed, we haven't talked about the actual workshop itself, I realized, but yeah, I did really value it, and it's really nice to kind of get out of my world of 2 screens and computers and spreadsheets and applications and various different guidance writing and all of that sort of stuff, to actually come out into the real world once in a while and see the impact that a lot of this work has. And it was very humbling, actually, to hear from some of the participants who'd worked on arts activities in their care homes or in their supported residences, and just kind of hear from them firsthand really how important this work is. And it was revitalizing, and just reminds me of why I do what I do and why I love what I do, really. Like, I think I need to do that a lot more.
Thank you. I felt exactly the same. I come away feeling that it's real.
Yeah.
And if I sit here in my office, it's detached, really. So to go there and to actually hear people talk, people telling their stories, it's very, very powerful. Very
Yeah,
powerful. And it makes you
yeah,
want to do more of it. Think, well,
it
I
really
want to
does.
do more.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think I mentioned this as well at the workshop that um I think people are scared of arts and culture a little bit, or they don't see what they do as being arts and culture. They see there's still a kind of um, traditional view of what arts and culture is and can be. Um, and people don't see their own creativity as being, valid a lot of the time. And I think somebody said it was a care home manager at the workshop said something about like they didn't really understand creativity and they had to Google it or something. And I just kind of wanted to finish on a point about that being okay, and it's okay to not to Google creativity and then see what you can find and try things out and experiment and see what works, see what your residents like, see what they enjoy. It's part of enjoyment. It doesn't have to be perfect. We really value ambitious and high quality arts and cultural experiences. And of course, that's a step that we would want people to take if they were getting funding from Arts Council. But from a personal point of view, just engaging in any form of creativity is massively important, including like reading a book or singing along to a record.
Yeah, it's a sort of everyday creativity, isn't it?
Mm.
It's sort of, we can't all be skilled artists, but we can all do creative stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we have to be creative to live our lives. We
Yeah.
couldn't live our lives if we weren't. We
Yeah.
weren't creative, to be honest.
And it's how we connect to each other, and that's what we want to form, isn't it? Connections.
It's
And
absolutely.
especially when you're living close to other people, how do you create a connection with your neighbors? Like it's through engaging in creative work and
It is, and
having
it's,
encouraging those conversations.
of course, it's underpins the relationality that we
Yeah,
based the workshops around, really. It's
yeah.
about how you relate to other people, and you can use creativity and creative practice to actually do that.
Yeah.
Um, so I'd just like to say thank you very much. That was lovely. Really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
It's
So
lovely
thank
to
you
have
very
that
much.
conversation.
It was really good. I really had a good time. Thank you. I'll stop the recording there.